Dyer wave
3.
Our anthropology is not derived by human psychology or, empirical data from MIT or something like this. It's derived from the revealed aspect of what we see in Christology. And so there's no real way to diagnose man's problem and to understand man and man's anthropology, as I said, without the right theology. Logos is the icon of the Father, and man is the icon of God. We are the image of God.
Dyer wave
3.
Greetings.
In the future,
Can you hear me? Can you unmute? Just maybe unmute your microphone.
There we go. Can you hear me?
Greetings, Father. Yes. How are you?
I am good. How are you, Jay?
I'm doing well. Thanks for coming. We are live, so I want to welcome you to the channel and let everybody know this is Fr Mikhail, and he was put in contact with me by some friends, and we decided that it would be a good opportunity to do a stream to talk about maybe the history of Unionism from his perspective, his background, what took him on the course that he took into Orthodoxy, now as a priest in the Orthodox Church. And I have his Patreon link below, so that you can support Fr Mikhail in the Patreon if you'd like to. And then maybe I thought we could play some of the clips that I didn't get to from Lofton's argumentation about Catholicism versus Orthodoxy, and see where it goes from there. But how are you, Fr Mikhail?
I'm doing well. How are you? It's
Doing well.
Of course,
as well.
an honor to be here. Yeah, good. It's an honor to be here, and just wanted to say thank you for all the work you do. A good amount of the young men who have converted to Orthodoxy at my parish have come by way of a lot of the work you've done, and a lot of the streams you've done, and it's been very helpful for them in their journey to the church. So, thank you for doing what you do.
Awesome. Well, thank you. I'm glad to hear that. It's always encouraging, and I'm glad to see that we're bearing fruit. So,
Absolutely.
Do you want to tell us whatever you're comfortable telling us about you and your background and your journey, and where you came from and what got you into the world of Eastern Catholicism, and then what you encountered there, and then what led you to where you are now? How do you want to go about that story?
Yeah, I don't mind starting kind of from the beginning. My family had on my dad's side had immigrated to Canada in 1914, and he was ordained a priest a few years after coming to Canadian soil, because they obviously needed priests for their growing communities. And my family came from what is now modern day Ukraine. But anyways, what ended up happening was that my father and his brothers all fell away from the faith. They didn't maintain the faith of their forefathers. And my father met, my mother, who was a wonderful woman and who was a Protestant at the time, and they had me. So I was raised in kind of the evangelical Pentecostal Protestant movement, which was just absolute insanity. And so I was very quickly disenfranchised with it, actually, pretty early on. And then as I moved towards my 20s and started moving out to go to college, I thought, I'm not going to keep doing this. And so I kind of fell out of faith. And then, at around the age of 25 or 24, I converted to Roman Catholicism and was pretty quickly dissatisfied with it. And so what I decided to do after that was move on to nothing. And so I thought, if this isn't the truth, then nothing else is. And I went through some hardships and got pushed back towards Christ. And when I met my wife, who was raised Roman Catholic because she's Polish, we thought, yeah, we need a church to go to. We need to start getting serious. So we started going to a Latin mass. That really wasn't panning out well.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah, sure.
What was when you were starting to doubt the Roman Catholic Church at that point? What was the source of the doubts at that time?
By and large, it really came to a head with not just seeing some of the innovations with the Novus Ordo, or with seeing the issues with certain figures in the Catholic Church promoting homosexuality. One being Father James Martin, who was being endorsed by the Catholic university where I live. And actually, I went there and got into an argument with him. So I could tell that story some other time. It's pretty funny.
Oh, wow.
but yeah, Father James Martin and I had an argument over a Zoom call lecture at King's College. So
Oh, wow.
yeah, it was pretty wild. But anyways, what ended up happening was the Pachamama incident really shook my wife, and she thought, okay, because she had fallen into the typical, modern girl, I'm spiritual, not religious thing. And so she said, I didn't leave that lukewarm spirituality for this, for idol worship to happen. She started looking into the church history along with me, and she said, this just seems like, a massive attempt to just grab as much power as possible and remain secular and relevant in the secular sphere. And she said, we need something authentic. And I said, yeah, and so we started going to Eastern Catholicism because we were still thinking, oh, we had to be under the Pope. And that's where I first started learning about St. Gregory Palamas. And so for me, St. Gregory started very quickly disproving a lot of the Roman Catholic theological standpoints. And then, of course, seeing at the parish I was going to, they even venerated St. Mark of Ephesus.
Right.
But when you find out why these guys are saints, you got to ask yourself, why are they commemorating them? In that book from Uncut Mountain Press, the Apodictic Treatise, on the procession of the Holy Spirit. It's this one right here, actually.
Yeah.
Right in the first bit of the preamble, he refers to the Latins as the children of the devil. He says, the devil's like a hydra who has sprouted many heads, and he names some of them as Eunomians, Arians, Nestorians, and then he says the Latins are the latest edition.
Right.
and so these guys are venerating him as a saint. But at the same time, he's telling them, and he says right in the opening line of the first treatise, that communion with the Latins is impossible,
right,
for as long as they proclaim the Filioque.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So this was beginning to kind of stick in your head and be an issue. Did you take this to, all the Uniate buddies and clergy and, people that you knew, and was this brought up? Because I'm always curious to hear what their response to this is.
So, the Uniate priest at the church I was going to, he was a decent guy. He was not a fan of Thomas Aquinas, yet he always would end up kind of ending things off with, well, our theology is more compatible than we think. And I'm thinking, on a moral level, on a practical level, it really isn't. The theologies contradict one another pretty
right,
stark contradictions between the two of them. And I kind of challenged it a bit, and I thought, okay, so if the papists created the new calendar, why are we on the old calendar? And if St. Gregory Palamas was declared a saint for his defense against Barlaam and the scholastic position, as well as his treatise against the Filioque, then why are we commemorating him as a saint? Aren't we by default already saying that the Orthodox faith is the true faith?
Right, exactly.
And his response was, well, there's benefits to being with Rome, which, we can fill in the blanks there.
Well, was his take that the benefits are practical or like geopolitical or theological? What is
his take was at least the way he said it, because he never clarified. And I even asked him, what do you mean? And he just kind of nodded at me. So I figure he meant monetary.
Right. Well, in different time periods, that was actually used to bring people back under the papacy at times. The papacy would offer money, and we'll build you schools, just submit to Rome, this kind of a thing.
Yeah, that's what they did in Antioch to the Melkites. They said, oh, we'll free schooling for the kids. You just have to commemorate me. And that's the thing. St. Gregory again says that with the musings and the language of oh no, we're actually the same. He said it's the same kind of whispering that the devil whispered to Eve in the garden to conceal the harm in his words.
Yeah, exactly. I was going to bring up that first few pages of the Apodictic Treatise, because that's just now finally out in print. I had an advanced copy. I got to read it 2 years ago, and so to me, I wasn't surprised, just because I had Father Meyendorf's book, Study of Palamas, and although it doesn't have the actual text, he was relating what was in the Greek text of the Apodictic Treatise even years ago when he wrote that book, and he pointed out in that book that he calls the Latin satanic. So I already knew that Palamas had that position, but until the Apodictic Treatise was in English, I guess a lot of people just didn't know or care or whatever. But I can't stress how really strong this argument is, and this is why it's an argument that we always kind of push, which is that you can't on the one hand have people who reject the papacy and the filioque for centuries suddenly become saints and be correct. It just doesn't make any sense. And it's not just a matter of, well, maybe it was unclear in their time. No, the dates of St. Gregory of Palamas are decades after 1274, right? So the Council of Lyons in 1274 in the Roman Church is the first public dogmatic pronunciation of the eternal double hypostatic procession. So that's the very definition of filioque that the East can't accept. It's declared decades before the time of St. Gregory of Palamas, and it's almost a century later when the Palamite synods occur and reject this. So the point is that you can't have this sort of out like, well, he just didn't know any better. Well, no, he did, because he existed decades after Lyons, and the Palamite synods are called in response to Lyons, and that's all covered in the classic text from Papadakis on Gregory of Cyprus and the Palamite Synod. So, there's not really an out here, is what I'm trying to say. There's not like a way to get out of this.
Yeah, there really isn't. I mean, and now that we do have the treaties in English, I think we're going to see a lot more coming as a result of this. And I mean, even with the Latins and their attempt at this kind of ecumenistic and very deceptive acceptance of a saint who is a saint for his very positions he took against them, is actually, if they were to claim to be the Apostolic Church, which they do, if they were to take the apostolic canons and the canons of Laodicea, they'll realize that they're actually violating Canon 34 and I believe 35 to 37, which Canon 34 says, you will not depart from the martyrs of Christ, and you will not venerate the martyrs and saints of the schismatic church, right? The martyrs are the highest tier of saints, and so when you look at that, they're already openly defying apostolic canon. We have our own issues in Orthodoxy, but one thing you do not see is a church-wide canonization and acceptance of heterodox saints.
Yes. Yeah, and this is something that Rome seems to have kind of flip-flopped on many times. For example, in the case of Constantinople I, that was that ecumenical council, which actually defined the Trinity in the Cappadocian sense, was called out of communion with Rome, closed out of communion with Rome, defined the Trinity without Rome. The saint who presided, Saint Melitius, died out of communion with Rome, which, as we know, according to Unum Sanctum, according to Cantate Domino, even if you die outside of communion with Rome as a martyr, Cantate Domino says that your martyrdom is of no effect. However, that is not always a consistent. Apparently that's not the case, right? It can be flip-flopped. You can say, you can have an ecumenical council confirming the Trinity out of communion with Rome. And so how does that make any sense if the very heart of the faith, the doctrine of Trinity, doesn't require Roman approval, doesn't require the communion with the papacy to be known, to be effective, to be dogmatic? Again, this really just underdoes the whole position, but that's just one example coming up into the era that you're talking about, where you have three pillars of orthodoxy: St. Mark of Ephesus, St. Gregory of Palamas, St. Photius, all of whom in their day were opposed to the papacy and the Latin approaches to these questions. And they're now all accepted by uniates, and there's been a lot of work to revise their status. For example, the famous book by the uniate scholar, Father Dvornik. Dvornik wrote the Phocian Schism, which kind of revamped the attitude of the Roman Catholic Church towards him. Even people in the Roman Catholic world, friends of Lofton like Albrecht, they tout this book as now, it's all good now. Well, it may sound all good, but this is a change of dogma, because canonization and excommunication fits under the classification of dogma. And so if Rome, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was just agreeing. It absolutely does, and that's the thing. It's even St. John Chrysostom says that that the sin of schism is so severe that the blood of martyrdom doesn't even wash it away. And so you find a lot of internal consistency with the Latins, where they say that they uphold the apostolic faith, but then it's like you said, they can arbitrarily redefine when they don't. And it's whenever it's politically advantageous, or they stand to grab a lot of land or a lot of parishes and to gain more power in a region. This is something to some extent that is even touched upon. There's another book from Uncut Mountain Press that not a lot of people talk about, and that's the Metropolitan Philaret of New York book. And you have in there some pretty important epistles from this Rocor hierarch, who was around at the time, where we see that really big push made yet again by the Latin Church for an ecumenical dialogue with the Orthodox. And of course, a lot of this is a response to what's happening during Vatican II. Some of it is a response to Patriarch Athenagoras putting the church on the new calendar. And it's I would definitely recommend this if you kind of want to get into that. And he is definitely, Metropolitan Philaret's definitely a very important read. And he goes into the details of how ecumenism, and he says a lot of the same things that St. Gregory says in his treatise, that the Latins aren't just opposing the Holy Fathers and the dogmas of the church, but a lot of the time they oppose the words of Christ himself. Christ himself was the one who said that the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father alone. He never says "and from me," and there's a huge distinction between, of course, energetic procession and hypostatic origin.
Absolutely.
And that's something that even they admit in the Uniate Church. And the Uniate Church I went to, the pews, because they had pews there, which it's not that orthodox, and they'll claim it's the same faith. They were willing to receive Orthodox people via recitation of the creed in the middle of the church, so just confession of faith and maybe confession of sins. And even then, they most of the time just didn't do anything more than just read the creed and then receive communion, which again is accepting the forbidden fruit. Except there's no fruit there; it's just rot.
Right.
But when you open their books there, they used to have the Filioque in there prior to Vatican II, because with the Ultramontanism of Vatican I, they imposed the Filioque on the Uniates. Right. And you could see the priest meticulously went through every single book and scratched out the Filioque. And I'm thinking, but if it's the same faith, if you're in communion with the Pope, why are you rejecting something so fundamental to their dogma?
Yeah, well, I mean, just on the face of it, prima facie, if the Pope ensures the unity of the faith, then how can we have two different creeds?
Precisely.
Right? The Church doesn't have two different creeds; it has one creed.
No. The unity of the faith, of course, for us Orthodox, is in the person of Christ himself. But one thing I would argue is that the Latins have fallen into either a Monophysite ecclesiology or an Nestorian ecclesiology.
Absolutely. Yep. Totally. In fact, I don't agree with kind of the trek that Dr. Philip Sherrard took towards the end, where he kind of went more and more perennialist, but he has a really good book critiquing the metaphysics of the papacy, and he basically says that as well. He says that the one and the many confusion and imbalance in the Trinitarian relations in the Latin view, in his mind, in his argument, affects the ecclesiology and the papacy. You get an imbalance in the church due to the imbalance in the dyad doctrine of the Filioque, and so he argues that very point as well.
Yeah, and that's the thing. It's like they don't. They say that, well, the Filioque was a response to heresy. That was one thing I was told of the Uniate Church, where when they were trying to sympathize with the Latins, they said, well, it was a response to heresy. It was their way of responding to a form of Arianism, because they're trying to say, see, the Son is equal in greatness to the Father, or is co-eternal with him. But the problem is that the Son himself, Christ, says in Scripture, in the book of Matthew, I think it's in chapter 18, I can't recall the exact chapter number, but he says that the Father is greater than me. And he doesn't mean in terms of power or in terms of a lack of unity in their divine essence. But what he's speaking to is in the fact that the Father begets him. He is the source. He is the uncaused cause of divinity, right? And so, by giving the same attributes of the Father to the Son, and they claim that the Father's given everything to the Son except being Father. Well, what is there to remain that is specific to the hypostasis
to be the sole cause? Exactly.
Yeah. It's like, so it's just a phenomenal contradiction that they have, and they can't seem to reconcile it. They can't seem to you know to kind of grasp that this is further proof that they aren't the true church, because they haven't maintained what is believed everywhere by everyone at all times.
Yeah, I think one of the big puzzle pieces for me in this regard was coming to the realization, which is something that Dr. Bo Branson discusses a lot, which is that it's the Cappadocian theology that's accepted at Constantinople I. I'd mentioned Constantinople I earlier as the Trinitarian Council had called and closed outside of Rome, and then venerated this. Rome venerates the saint of that council who died out of communion with Rome, Saint Melitius. And the irony there is that it's not just the attitude of a lot of Roman Catholics is, well, I don't really care about the theology of the council. I only care about the specific statements in the council, because that's all that matters. But the councils themselves are really pointing out that this is an acceptance of the theology of the Cappadocians. I'm not saying everything that every Cappadocian taught, but the theology that the two Gregories and St. Basil taught is that you cannot get away from the notion of sole cause as Father. I mean, none of them teach that there's a co-cause, a secondary cause, or a lesser cause, or a participation in sole cause.
Right.
If Father,
because otherwise the Son would have to beget himself, and the Spirit would have
right.
to process himself.
And a lot of people in the Roman Catholic mindset think, well, that's like a medieval debate. That's a medieval dispute later on. It's not. It's the affirmation at Constantinople I of the Cappadocian teaching of sole cause, Father as sole cause. Soshinsky admits that the Cappadocians don't teach filioque. And the reason I'm bringing that up again is that the irony again is that it's Constantinople I, which is this council called out of communion with Rome, closed out of communion with Rome, accepting the Cappadocian theology, which Rome later says, okay, we accept that as an ecumenical council, but this is post Pope St. Leo, right? So it's after Pope St. Leo that Rome says, okay, now we do accept Constantinople I. But that would mean that filioque is not plausible in the sense of double eternal hypostatic procession. And so this is just so devastating if we really think about it. And I mean, everything I've seen over the years shows this to be the case. I think it's an open and shut case. And if this is the case, I mean, this is really enough to refute the whole papal system as a whole.
Mm-hmm. I think so too. And I mean, we just don't see how the papacy is able to affect any real unity. When we even look at the fact that there's they have their own theology in the Uniate Church. They have their own set of canon laws, which they're much closer to ours. Of course, they really sacrifice the most important aspects. But then you also have issues where they're in communion with Miaphysites, with the Coptic Catholics, and then they have the Assyrian Catholics who still hold to Nestorian theology, and they'll even commemorate Patriarch Nestorius. Or Mar Nestorius, as they call him.
Yeah,
right?
this is very. I can't understand this. This is baffling to me. I mean, the Council of Ephesus, Saint Cyril. I mean, it's just abundantly, it's so clear that Nestorius teaches a dual subject Christology, and so what is the rationale or basis for this? I don't understand. Is it just purely ecumenist? I mean, is there some kind of explanation? I don't get it.
I think it's largely ecumenistic, and the funny thing is that the Latins themselves are constantly influenced by heresy, and that's something I realized. They always justify everything as, oh, it's a response to heresy. It's a response to heresy, and I thought, you're the church that is defined by heresy. You don't respond to it; you're defined by it. Ecumenism is it's largely a Protestant concept.
Oh, totally. Yeah. It's like an Anglican. Well, actually it's prior to England it's an ancient papal thing, so to speak. But
yeah,
but the modern stuff is like the Anglican branch theory.
Yeah, exactly. And so, and of course the Anglicans had to develop branch theory to justify their own existence.
Right.
They had to do that in order to somehow say, well, see, we got our apostolic succession from Rome, but we're allowed to branch off and be our own kind of crazy ordeal. And you kind of see that even happening within the papacy itself, and especially with the Uniates. I mean, I've even met Uniates who openly venerate Saint Alexius Toth. And
I was going to bring that up. There's we found in some of the Russian Catholic books, like multiple post schism Russian Orthodox saints being venerated in the Russian Catholic calendar.
Oh wow! And that's the thing. It tells you, it tells you what is really at the heart of papism, and it's about temporal political power.
Right. Exactly.
You know, that's really the start of papism. It was the, kind of the agreements between Charlemagne, and then of course, you have the donation of Constantine. And another fact that a lot of papists overlook is that in the Fifth Ecumenical Council, Emperor Justinian was calling for the excommunication of the Pope because of his defense of monothelitism.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I get criticized for talking about geopolitical stuff, but from my vantage point, I mean, how are we going to understand the history of Byzantium and the papacy and the Frankish papacy, without knowing and having some understanding of the geopolitical power influence here? I mean, the Frankish thesis is confirmed by Szyszynski. It's confirmed by St. Photius himself in his letters, where he says that it was Frankish missionaries sent into Bulgarian territories to evangelize for the Filioque as a geopolitical power move, right? Because that meant you were under, Charlemagne and under the Latin influence. So we can't divorce geopolitical power from these issues, precisely because, as you said, the rise of the temporal power of the papacy is directly connected with the desire for temporal power, geopolitical power, and that's bound up with the history of Unionism itself.
It's true. I mean, that's ultimately what Unionism is. It was an attempt for the Pope to grab land closer and closer to Russia, and now we have, as a result, the Ruthenian Catholics, the Ukrainian Catholics, and they're all calling themselves Byzantine Rite, but they haven't really maintained any of the spirit of Byzantium with them.
Yeah, that's a great point. I did want to add too that because I don't have the modern print copy. I will get a print copy, but I still have my advanced copy. And one of the things about the apodictic treatise, and I highly recommend that if you're new to this topic, or if you're interested in the issues of Roman Catholicism and Orthodoxy and Eastern Catholicism, you're definitely going to want to read the apodictic treatise, because there's a great introductory essay by Father Moody, who's a friend of mine, and it's not just a matter of the Latins following Satan. What he does in this book is take the approach of St. Photius in the mystagogy and kind of expands it. So it's very similar to St. Photius's mystagogy, but he expands it and makes very clear that, look, I'm following within the tradition, not just of St. Photius, but also of these Cappadocians, right? It's because the origin of this whole approach to the triad is Cappadocian. And the reason this is so important is that in the Roman Catholic view, they tend to view this as schools. Oh, well, you can have like a Cappadocian school of the Trinity, and maybe there's a Thomistic school of the Trinity, and there's a Scotus school of this. And it's not like that. There is only one approach and phronema to the Trinity and to Christology, and it is the one confirmed by the ecumenical councils.
Yeah, because otherwise you don't have Catholicity, and that's the thing with the approach that they take with their ecclesiology. You can kind of see it reflected in what happened in Vatican II and between Pope Paul VI and Patriarch Athenagoras. When they said, "Oh, we can lift the anathemas now," and that's essentially what was kind of happening in the mindset behind the Unia. Was this whole idea, oh, see, we're healing the schism, we're coming back into union. But these anathemas, as pointed out in the book that I mentioned, Metropolitan Philaret, they existed. And he says this in his sorrowful epistle, I think the second sorrowful epistle. He says they existed for 9 centuries before this. And does this mean that the reasons for pronouncing them, which are known to all, have ceased to exist? And they have not. And does this mean that the errors of the Latins, which one was required to renounce upon entering the church, no longer exist?
Yeah, this is a great point against the pan heresy of ecumenism, right? I mean, how could the church cease to have the authority and the necessity to call out and warn against error? I mean, if we've read the Synodicon since the Seventh Council, then isn't that kind of fundamental to what we do? And I've actually, pointed out as an apologetic point that if the Seventh Ecumenical Council has this anathema service, kind of loosely attached to it. I know there's variations of what the actual service says over the years, but the basic idea comes out of the Seventh Ecumenical Council, which oddly enough Rome gives verbal credence to, but they don't actually believe the canons or the theology of the Seventh Council. The very fact that the Orthodox Church is the only one that still reads that service, the Synodicon, and the Triumph of Orthodoxy, to me that says that this is a clear testimony and proof that only the Orthodox Church is in continuity with the first 7 councils. Like, it's the only one that has that theology, and the very existence of the Uniates is also testifying to that point, because Uniates, as I understand, and I wanted to ask you this question next, because it's not always clear, and I think Uniates in the Roman Catholic world do different things, but do Eastern Catholic churches openly do or read on the Triumph of Orthodoxy Sunday anything related to the Synodicon? Do you know?
With the church that I went to, I don't recall them doing that,
Okay.
but they, of course, put the icon of Saint Gregory Palamas out in the middle, and he gave the priest there gave a homily on how Saint Gregory Palamas defended, as he put it, Eastern Rite theology. And when we look at how he approaches it, and I'm sure this is common in Uniate churches, they have to water it down, because otherwise they're revealing the schizophrenic theology that underlies them. You'll have on one hand saying, "Oh, no, we're Latin in the fact that we're in communion with Rome," or as they like to say, in a very kind of underhanded manner, that they're Orthodox in communion with Rome. In all reality, they don't maintain anything that is remotely Orthodox in their mindset and their phronema. The concept of phronema is totally abandoned there.
Right.
And of course, there's nothing explicitly Roman amongst them either. They're kind of their own thing. They're just connected by their submission to the papacy. And that's the thing, a lot of papists will say, well, you have patriarchs who are committing the heresy of ecumenism. But the difference is, for us, the patriarchs, the bishops, they're not the church. Christ is the church.
Yeah, they're not.
And our head is infallible. Yeah, they're not the Pope. They're not supreme, in every jurisdiction. Last I checked, Patriarch Kirill doesn't have a say on who is elected a bishop here, not in Rokor. And, from what I understand, Patriarch Bartholomew has some influence on the Goarch, but, either way, what he does and what Patriarch Kirill does doesn't necessarily have an effect on what our bishops do, because, we don't have a Pope. We don't have a supreme earthly figure. We have a supreme heavenly figure. For us, Christ is the infallible head of the church.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I wanted to just point out this kind of, I think in the Orthodox world it's kind of like a no-brainer, but a lot of Roman Catholics don't really know about this, which is that in the Eastern notion you have autocephaly, right? You have autocephalous churches, and to me this itself is a refutation of the papacy, because if you go back and look at the Council of Ephesus, right, so in 431 it first grants autocephalous status to the Church of Cyprus. So the Ecumenical Council is granting to the Church of Cyprus its own independent autocephalous church. And this whole modus operandi itself attests to the fact that this is not the Vatican I, one guy has universal supremacy view, because there's nothing in this about, well, they have autocephalous status except for the Pope, right? The Pope can still do whatever he wants over Cyprus, which would be the Vatican I mindset. There's nothing like that. Anywhere in Ephesus is anything like this. And the very idea of an autocephalous church doesn't even make sense in the papal universal, superstructure system. So in my view, just the existence of autocephalous churches is a refutation of universal, absolute, autocratic, unilateral jurisdiction.
It is, and that is something that a lot of the Roman Catholic apologists, at least from the little bit that I've been able to glance, have kind of held to. They try to make it sound like we are somehow disorganized and that we have no way of governing ourselves, but we actually do within our autocratic structures, like you said. And if anything, for me, this proves that we have the unity of faith, because despite having several autocephalous local churches all in communion with each other, we have managed to maintain doctrinal unity. And when one of us falls into error, then a schism occurs. And sometimes schisms occur for other reasons that are not necessarily related to a dogmatic issue, but sometimes a canonical infringement, such as what's going on between Constantinople and Moscow right now. Because it's not that there's a major Christological or theological controversy other than we have the EP kind of trying to redefine himself as a pope.
Yeah, exactly. Now, I've always wanted to ask Eastern Catholics because I'm not sure. I was never really involved in Eastern Catholic stuff. I think I visited one time at ever back in maybe 2003. I don't even remember. But in the Eastern Catholic mindset, is there a notion of autocephalous churches at all? I mean, I know that.
Yeah,
they
loosely.
Okay.
Yeah, they have for the Ukrainian Catholic Church, which is the one I went to. They have who they refer to as Patriarch Sviatoslav, and Patriarch Sviatoslav is essentially the head for their group, but he's ultimately in submission to the Pope of Rome.
Sure.
And actually, there was a controversy between him and the Pope when he had an ecumenical meeting with the Coptics, and he actually took issue with that. I can't remember the details of the issue he took with it, but the Pope had to quickly backpedal and apologize for his actions. So I'd have to look into it because it was a long time ago that I saw this, but I remember it struck me as revealing the stark disunity that is present in Roman Catholicism and in the papal structure as a whole.
We did an interview with a fellow some years ago who had been Uniate and became Orthodox, and one thing that came up was this sort of a gradation of views amongst Uniate to like Zogbyite and Melkite, and is there any insight into that? Is it the case that you kind of have these varying views from like almost Orthodox and not really caring what Rome does to Eastern Catholics who are really close to Rome and more or less because sometimes you hear these things like, well, Melkite catechisms say things like, oh, we only believe 7 councils, as if you can reject and not believe Western councils. That doesn't make any sense because Vatican I clearly states that it's binding upon the whole church. So is there this sort of varying levels of attitude towards Rome amongst various Uniate groups?
Yeah, from what I observed, for sure. I mean, I know that the Ukrainian Catholics really, really loved Vatican II. For them, that was their saving grace because they were able to start, funny enough, because of Vatican II, they were able to start de-Latinizing. So they were able to have more of their iconographic depictions up. They weren't required to have depictions of the Sacred Heart or the Immaculate Heart. The other thing that I noticed with them is that they really removed a lot of the some of the other hallmarks like statues. There was no holy water font in the church. It was almost an Orthodox church, just devoid of the life that an Orthodox church actually has within it. What I noticed with them as well is that when it would come to things like except the differences between them and the Melkites, the Ukrainian Catholics were a little bit more stringent on the application of the holy canons, even pertaining to music, whereas the Melkites had no problem using instruments in church.
Gotcha. Interesting. No, I didn't know that. Wow. Yeah, there's somebody brought to my attention. I'd forgotten about this, but there's actually statements in Vatican II about updating Eastern Catholic worship. So that's curious to me that maybe to read it charitably, they meant updating in the sense of letting Ukrainian Catholics go back to more of their Slavic roots or something like this. But some people were reading that as, no, actually the Eastern rites in the Catholic Church also need to be updated like Vatican II in the sense of like guitar masses and hippie mass, like hip hop mass. I mean, who knows what it means, but I mean, did you notice any kind of like liturgical innovations that went along with the liberalism of Vatican II, or was it typically something that tended more towards traditional, Russian style worship?
It was definitely closer to traditional Russian style worship. That's one of the reasons why I started going there. For one, the Latin Mass was out of town, and in the Catholic diocese where I'm from, they really punished the traditional Catholics and have really pigeonholed them. So I started going to the Uniate church because with my wife being a nurse and with work and commuting, it was just easier to go to a church that was within much shorter driving distance. And so, I started being more interested as a result in Orthodoxy because this was something that looked and smelt and felt Orthodox. But what was interesting that I noticed is that they violated another canon that they claimed to uphold, and that's that they would serve two liturgies each Sunday on the same altar with the same priest, which is something that canonically we're not supposed to do. It's one liturgy per altar, per priest, per day.
Interesting.
A concelebrating priest who's just acting as a second priest, he can consecrate Holy Communion if he did a liturgy afterwards, but the priest who just consecrated it can't do it again that day.
Okay. Yeah, I'm not I don't know canon law that well, so
I
I'm
don't
familiar
know
with
too well either. So
yeah. Well, so is that like a canon from like the first millennium that is kind of normative, or
that I can't recall. That's just one of those things that you kind of learn early on with becoming a priest. That
right.
It's one of those things that, hey, you don't do this,
right?
And I couldn't tell you the canon. I mean, there's so many, and a lot of the canons I've been focusing on lately have been addressing this issue of Unionism and the whole idea of ecumenism, because that's what Unionism ultimately is. Before we had the pan heresy of ecumenism and a name for it,
right.
and the Rocor anathema against it in the 1980s, we had Unionism, which
right.
was really, I would say, the prototype to ecumenism.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's exactly what I was getting at with. I think the predecessors to modern day ecumenism, if we really wanted to go back, we could go back to Renaissance papacy, where we had this a lot of not just flirtations, but actual acceptance and promotion of Neoplatonism. So Renaissance Neoplatonism kind of had this power to be a system by which other world religions could be systematized, and this is that period, of Alexander VI and the Borgias, and this fascination with Hermeticism and Neoplatonism. And so a lot of the syncretism may have its roots there, and then that flourishes, as you said, or we see this popping up in different periods when there's these attempts to bring Orthodox back under Rome. Those are all predecessors to modern ecumenism. And then the weird part about this, as you well know, is that the modern Vatican was so strongly opposed and condemned interfaith gatherings and any notions of ecumenism until after Pius XII, right? And Mortalium Animos is 1928 by Pius XI, and it has one of the strongest rejections of any forms of interfaith prayer meetings, gatherings, etc., because they're a scandal, because they dilute the faith, and because they're apostasy. The text says so all the way up until 1920s. Rome explicitly rejected ecumenism, although, as to grant your point, yes, that doesn't mean that they weren't kind of preparing the way and being proto-ecumenists themselves with Unionism. But then we have this radical shift right after John the 23rd, who opens the door of the church to breathe a new air and all this kind of stuff, and it's just such a stark reversal. And I remember reading Xavier Wren's whole history of Vatican II. And there's a lot of details in that. He was somebody who supported Vatican II, and there's some nice nuggets and details in that, where it was actually John the 23rd, I think, who was one of the first people to invite Protestants to the Vatican to engage in public services. So,
they were invited to sit on some of the council meetings as well for
sure.
Vatican II and
Correct.
to contribute. And I mean, this explains why we also see such a Protestantization of the Mass. Right. And so, with the Unionism and with the ecumenism for the Latins, it has a different definition. For us, it's based on apostolic faith. It's based on dogmatic truth, and maintaining that unbroken faith, that unbroken dogmatic truth transmitted through the holy apostles to the holy fathers into our times now. But for them, ecumenism just simply meant, as Thomas Aquinas said, and that was any creature under the Roman pontiff, or who is not under the Roman pontiff, is damned.
Yeah, exactly right. And then that's Dictatus Papae unum sanctum cantate Domino, right? Really extremely strict in those regards. Did you want to? Is there anything else you'd like to point out about? Feel free about Eastern Catholicism, areas that you see are of central import for contradictions or inconsistencies. I thought also if we wanted to, we could play more of Michael Lofton's critique of our takes and our apologetic. I've got that pulled up if we want to hear some of those other arguments. Is there anything else that you wanted to bring up about Eastern Catholicism?
Yeah, just in terms of Eastern Catholicism, with how they say they're Orthodox in union with Rome, or how they have kind of the best of both worlds. Again, this is a very inconsistent point of view. This is schizophrenic theology at its best. Where even if you want to look at some of the theology again of Saint Gregory Palamas, who we apparently both venerate, and what does heresy do? And heresy effectively does make one an atheist, according to the theology of Saint Gregory Palamas. And the problem is when one believes even in a single heresy and deviates from the truth, they set up for themselves, the belief in a God that is not revealed as he was to the prophets, to the holy apostles, and to the holy fathers. And as a result, they worship and believe in a non-existent God.
Yeah.
And so that's what you're getting with them, is that they can't decide between which version, of Christ that they follow. And for them, the church is no longer the body of Christ, but is merely the Omophorion, or the umbrella of the Pope.
Yeah, it's a sort of worldwide global political institution. And that's
and
more.
He is the church for them. That is the truth. He is the church.
Right. All right. So let's hear. As you guys know, I did a stream several days ago where I was rebutting a lot of these long-standing critiques and arguments from Michael Lofton. And I only got about halfway through his video, so I thought that if we wanted to, we could pick back up and kind of see where else he took this critique. And of course, if you don't remember, Michael was making the argument that Orthodoxy, the route of Orthodoxy, which he keeps characterizing as radical. So he's positioning himself, using a lot of liberal speak, as this radical centrist now, presumably because he's teamed up with Matt Fradd and other sort of Catholic Answers, Novus Ordo style people. So he's got to portray us as radical, as if Russian Orthodox Christianity is somehow not in communion with the rest of Orthodox Christianity, or that we have some sort of crazed position. This is just propaganda. But the argument was essentially that Taylor Marshall and traditional Catholics should look to us as a warning sign, as a red flag for where traditional Catholicism takes you. And in that regard, I would agree with Michael that if Taylor Marshall and other traditional Catholics were and will, I think they will, get more consistent, particularly Society of St. Pius X type people, it's going to move them in the direction of where we are, because the logic of this is basically, look, if true Catholicism can exist amongst traditional groups without Rome for the last 60, 70, 80 years, then that really begins to prove orthodoxy, because it means that true Catholicism does not require Rome. And if true Catholicism can exist and doesn't require Rome, then pretty much the arguments of the Roman See at Vatican I aren't the case, and that underdoes the whole system.
It really does. Yeah. So yeah, definitely. Let's look at some of what. Lofton
let's see where he takes. Now, I haven't heard all this, so I don't know which direction he's going to go in. So if you want to interject, just feel free to speak up, and I'll pause it. And if I think of something, I'll pause it as well.
Certainly.
Among other places, you've already accepted that. So if we're wrong about that, you guys are too. So we need to start looking into something else, like maybe Oriental Orthodoxy, because they didn't accept the Sixth Ecumenical Council. They didn't accept those claims, so they're not as committed as Eastern Orthodox to some of these things. Maybe we need to start looking into other.
I'm not sure what I think he's saying, like, oh, well, if you don't have the Pope, then maybe Oriental Orthodoxy, right? Like, I think that's where he was going with that.
Well, again, the Oriental Orthodox, of course, reject the notion of the two natures in one hypostasis, and they'll say that they believe, that they try to redefine Miaphysitism as believing in one incarnate nature. But the problem is, when you really press them on that, they'll say that it's the two natures married into one, which is actually a form of Arianism at this point, because now it's a created nature. It's a new created nature.
Well, and Michael's trying to do this clever sort of like, well, I guess that's just as viable as you guys because you don't have the Pope. The irony here, of course, is that, yeah, but the papacy now recognizes Assyrian so-called schismatics now, like, right, like Nestorius, Mar Nestorius, and the papacy now recognizes presumably Gregory Narek or these other formerly considered schismatic. Yeah. I mean, maybe Arius next, right? Maybe Arius will be recognized as not that bad of a guy next. So this actually, Michael's practical argument here is really undercut by the modern reversals of Rome.
Options at that point.
Can they defect and still remain Pope? Now, anybody in our audience who has read Vatican I?
By the way, did you notice he said, can they defect and still remain Pope? There is a distinction here between the occupant of the See of Rome and the See of Rome itself. The question of whether or not the individual who occupies the See of Rome can be a heretic is going to be distinct from whether or not he can teach heresy in his office. Those are two different things. One relates to
not really, no.
Yeah, not really, because I mean, while it's true that those are two different things, the Roman Catholic system doesn't actually have this out for, well, if Pope Francis writes a book denying the Trinity, it doesn't count because that's his private opinion.
Yeah.
I mean, if that happened, that it doesn't work. And the proof for this is that prior to Vatican II, the Holy Office would hold people, especially people like George Tyrrell or modernists, would hold them accountable for anything that they wrote and taught if it was heretical. So there's no such thing as this out where it doesn't count if Francis says a million heresies in everything that he writes or says. It only counts when he binds people to it or teaches publicly or officially. That's not actually true. And the very actions of the Holy Office show that that's not true. And so while it may be true, you can make a distinction. You can't actually separate the person from the heresy. Would you agree with that?
That's what I was getting at. Is like you can't separate the person from the heresy. I mean, the originators of heresies are called heresiarchs for a reason.
Right.
You know, they are the ones who typify and who begin the heresy. They started, and it's always born out of intellectual pride.
Yeah.
You know, and it's always born out of this idea that they have the singular revelation of truth, and that they are the sole ones who have the right to claim that truth or to dictate it.
Occupant as a private person, the other relates to the actual see in the actual teaching office itself. But you notice that he just conflated those two things instead of making a really important distinction there. We can have the question on what do we do if the occupant is personally guilty of heresy? He doesn't teach it in his office, but he's personally guilty of that. How does that then impact the Roman office? It impacts the Roman office in the exact same way you Eastern Orthodox already accepted Roman indefectibility and yet condemned Honorius as a heretic. It affects it in that way.
Right. So I covered this in the first stream where he's bringing up again the Sixth Council, and Michael's arguing that, oh, you accepted papal infallibility because of Pope St. Agatha's letter at the Sixth Council. But the reality is that if you look at the Sixth Council, Pope St. Martin at the Lateran Council, like 100 years or so before, maybe 50, 60 years before, had already condemned monothelitism. And so if the Sixth Council was operating on a papal mindset, all they would have done is refer to Pope St. Martin. They wouldn't have investigated the letter of Pope St. Agatha, which, by the way, teaches the essence energy distinction, which they don't even care about that. Like the whole letter is about the two wills and two energies in Christ. All they care about is the statement about the rock of Peter, which in the Orthodox, we have a reading of a lot of those texts that is perfectly compatible with Orthodoxy, all these so-called papal proof texts. And again, that very council condemns Pope Honorius not for being rude or being unclear, but for actually teaching heresy. And his condemnation is restated afterwards in the Synodicon of Orthodoxy. It recondemns Honorius. He's condemned in the Seventh Council as well. So the Sixth Council's condemnation of Honorius is for theology. It's doctrinal, and it's restated. And that itself disproves the Vatican I view, which is that councils are above popes, not popes above councils. The whole modus operandi is the opposite of what Lofton is saying about the Sixth Council and Pope Agatha.
Yeah, and what he's trying to do is he's trying to turn it on his head, and he's trying to say he's constantly trying to have those gotcha moments that just aren't really playing out here. This is an argument that he is really driving from his passion on the topic, and it's not really founded in anything real. Because again, we see where the councils supersede the popes. The popes don't supersede the councils. Otherwise, even in the Fifth Council, we wouldn't have seen a motion to excommunicate Pope Virgilius. It would have been unthinkable.
Well, I mean, the very idea of a council excommunicating a pope and condemning him as a heretic is just the opposite of Vatican I. So, I mean,
precisely, and it's the opposite of what Thomas Aquinas taught. Yeah.
More details on the case of Honorius, that was in the Father Stephen Andrew Domick video, where I engage orthodoxy and heterodoxy. So I show how we can reconcile the condemnation of Honorius with the same council who actually teaches Roman indefectibility of the teaching office of the Roman See. So I have a solution for that. I don't see Orthodox having a solution for that. So
knows that this issue has already been settled. I mean, has Michael Matt read Vatican I? Doesn't it tell you that the Roman See cannot defect?
Well, this is one point that I've brought up, because some radical traditionalists want to say, well, look, all Vatican I is doing is saying that the Pope is infallible when he teaches ex cathedra, and that's all they're aware of. They're not aware of other things in the same document taught by Vatican I that says, but the teaching office and the entire office of the Pope is going to be, to one extent or another, protected by the Holy Spirit.
Yes,
so
correct.
That is indefectibility.
Yeah, I agree with Michael there, and that's why he's in such a difficult position to try to defend and pope-splain for Frank, right? The idea of pope-splaining, right? So every time there's a new scandal every week that Frank engages in, these people go into overdrive to make it work in the mental gymnastics. But he's actually correct, and that's why he's doing what he has to do with all this mental gymnastics, is because he understands that Vatican I promises the indefectibility of the occupant of the see.
Yeah, whereas the indefectibility of a see in an office is different from the occupant, right? And so now he has to kind of go between the two,
right? And
he's trying to constantly justify the two. Whereas in Orthodoxy, we have a hierarch who falls into heresy. We can call it a council and we can depose it.
Well, I have a problem whenever you have radical traditionalists that are accusing the Pope of teaching heresy, because yes, they actually say he teaches heresy. For instance, Taylor Marshall claims that on multiple occasions. That Pope Francis teaches heresy
on multiple occasions.
Yeah, well, I like how Michael often ignores the kind of elephant in the room here. Does he, in fact, teach something heretical? I mean,
yeah, like give some examples and then prove that how it's not heresy. Prove the whole Pachamama thing wasn't heresy.
Yeah. Well, his explanation for Pachamama is that it's Mary.
Yeah, it's just so
I'm pretty sure Mary is not a human sacrifice deity. I mean, if you
I'm
look
pretty
up,
sure of that too.
I mean, Pachamama is a human sacrifice deity. So
yeah, I'm pretty sure the Mother of God is, and it's funny because I distinctly remember when the Pachamama idols were stolen. Pope Francis himself said, return the Pachamamas.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, but he's just appealing to the people of the indigenous tribes because really they pull a sleight of hand and say, "Aha, gotcha." It's a sleight of hand. It's like, "Oh, you thought it was Pachamama? No, it's Mary," right? So it's a sort of a typical Roman Catholic move there.
And also that Vatican II is taught heresy. He accuses it of Pelagianism, which is a condemned heresy. I have a problem with that because that does do violence to some things in Vatican I. It also does violence to Pope Pius XII and some things that he says in Humani Generis. It does violence to Donum Veritatis, among other places. And so, and also it's just the position that the Catholic theologians have rejected. They don't accept that teaching, that the Pope could teach heresy in his office. The question of whether or not he could personally be a heretic is very distinct from whether or not he could teach it, however.
No, I agree with...
If someone's a heretic, though, they are going to inevitably teach their heresy because they believe their heresy.
Yeah, all of these sort of scholastic distinctions are there to just really prop up the system when it's staring everybody in the face. And he had laughed earlier in this argument that the idea that Francis is involved in global elite machinations for global government. You mean the meetings that he goes to and publicly promotes?
Yeah, I was just going to say, you mean he's not? I mean, he's not exactly cryptic about it.
Yeah.
And I mean, when we look at this, when we really look at what the Latins are saying here, they are trying to prop up the same thing that you'll even see certain groups such as the Assyrians and the Coptics say, and that is that they believe the church itself is monophysite in nature, that it is of one nature, and as a result, it is perfect, and it can never have an element of human error introduced into it.
Oh,
Whereas,
interesting.
yeah, and this is something that Losky wrote about in his essays on two aspects of the church.
Yes, I've read that. That's great. It's a great essay. Yes, I've forgotten that.
It really
Yep.
is. And this is an example of an monophysite ecclesiology where he's trying to completely obliterate the humanistic aspects of the occupant of an office and trying to set it up like this office somehow will obliterate that and prevent an error from occurring. And so, this church doesn't reflect anything theandric.
Yeah.
It doesn't reflect anything theanthropic or anything synergistic between man and God. And ultimately, you have to ask yourself, how does your church affect salvation if that's the case?
Yeah.
Is it by blind obedience to whatever heresy and then correction will come with the wind? Or is it in the union of man and God? And again, as revealed through the prophets, the holy apostles, and the holy fathers. And,
Well,
and
let's
this
just
is
take-
something we don't see with them.
Let's just take the proposition St. Gregory Palamas is a heretic. So after the Council of Lyons, right, anyone who denied that council would be considered by the council to be heretical, right? So imagine it's 1274, Council of Lyons has met. They've declared anyone who disagrees with that doctrine of the Filioque or the papacy at that, whatever the papacy is at that point, the Roman see at that point, to be outside the church, to be a heretic. So St. Gregory Palamas, some decades later, disagrees. Councils are called. The 1274 Lyons is rejected. That puts, from the Roman Catholic vantage point, St. Gregory Palamas as a heretic outside the church for centuries. Then we get a revision of this due to ecumenism, due to Eastern Catholicism, due to the work of, in part, Father Francis Dvornik to rehabilitate St. Photius. Now we have a reversal. He can be accepted now. So what was he? What's true here? Which papacy, which Roman Catholic Church is the correct one? The one saying for centuries that he's a heretic. And by the way, their attempt to get out of this is to say, well, there's not an explicit pronunciation of heresy. It doesn't have to be. Anybody who rejects an ecumenical council, anybody who rejects the 1274 would be de facto heretic.
Well, the problem is here now they've run into the issue of what is it in their church that exactly sanctifies and deifies a man? What is it? What is it that brings man into union with God? Is it the reception of the mysteries? Is it the conquering of the passions?
Is it uncreated grace, or is it
uncreated grace, or is it the Pope? Yeah, because at this point, well, now that they're declaring him a saint, I guess by the Roman Catholic mind, they somehow have been able to, just by a simple declaration, pluck Saint Gregory out of the deepest pit of Hades and place him in the company of the saints. And it's like, okay, but our understanding is deification cannot happen outside of the body of Christ.
Right.
It doesn't happen outside of Christ. And it happens in Christ and through him. This is why we receive his body and blood. It's like you said, this is an indicator that they don't believe in uncreated grace.
Right. Exactly. No, in fact, it's explicit in Ludwig Ott that he has 4 propositions on grace. And the very first proposition is that you have to believe as a Catholic that grace is a supernatural accident distinct from God, a created supernatural accident. So I don't know how there's such a thing as a supernatural created accident that is also God but not God. That just really illustrates the incoherent nature of this.
Well, it's disjointed.
Yeah.
It's totally removed from any experience that the prophets, the saints of the church have had. It goes to show you that the Roman Catholics, for them, the church, again, it's like what I said earlier, it is the Pope.
Yeah, and to be clear, again, so if you have Ludwig Ott, this is pages 254 to 255. The first proposition on sanctifying grace is a created supernatural gift really distinct from God. That's the first proposition. So you have to believe that. And then Trent, by the way, makes it clear in the canons on justification that the righteousness of God that you receive in baptism is not the righteousness that God himself possesses. So that's part of Roman Catholic dogma. So that means
it's essentially like a simulacrum of his presence.
Exactly. And so it's a created supernatural. It's not uncreated.
His office.
Precisely.
They're going to say no, that there's this safety there, even when he's not teaching infallibly. And this is also expressed and reiterated in some very, very helpful homilies by John Paul II. And I've spoken about this infallible safety before, so I'm not going to reinvent the wheel here. But you'll notice Jay Dyer is actually bringing up a good point here. It's one of the same points that I've brought against the radical traditionalists. Where I'm going to disagree with Dyer is I'm going to say, but wait, I don't grant the claim that Pope Francis or anyone after Vatican II or Vatican II itself is guilty of something that does violence to indefectibility. I'm not going to grant that.
Okay.
And moreover,
So, in other words, John Paul II, Benedict, Francis have all preserved and violate the Catholic faith, and they're not guilty of any teaching error. So, I mean, keep in mind, let's not get lost in the weeds of the nuance of this council and this canon, this proposition. Michael has the job of defending Francis, and that's a really hard thing to do.
It's a terrible job.
Yeah, right.
It's not what I'd want.
I mean, it's almost, and again, we've said over here on our side many times that, Francis is a wonderful thing because he sort of gives us these gifts every month of a new big scandal, a new big document. And, the latest is this new synod about radical inclusivity. And so, as far as I understand, Francis seems to be on board with this, and this will just make it all the more easier for us, because is Michael really going to be able to continue to say that after a council about a synod about radical
after female diaconate, will he be able to say that? No, because then here we have again a clear and distinct deviation from things. And how come the Roman pontiffs will say, hey, this is something I forgot to mention in the uniate portion that we discussed at the start, but how come the popes will say, hey, you to be a priest you have to be celibate in the sense that you're not married, you're completely chaste. But then they permit the uniates to have married priests. But before I left the Uniate Church, I was being recruited to go to the Shatisky Institute and become a uniate priest. And I said, no, I'm not doing that.
Well, I mean, they'll say, well, it's just a discipline, right? So that's their out. But what do you say to that? I mean, it seems to be the irony.
Discipline, then
it's an irrational discipline, because the Seventh Council had already accepted Trullo, saying that you can't forbid this, right?
Yeah, that you can't forbid deacons and priests who are married who become ordained from even having a relationship with their wife, because then it's a violation of what the Lord says.
Yeah.
Let no man tear asunder what God has joined. And this is again something you see in the treatise that St. Gregory Palamas constantly points out, is that the theology of the Latins is often at times at odds with the words of the Lord himself. So they're placing created concepts, they're placing a man above the God man. And this is why there's nothing theanthropic, there's nothing uncreated in terms of grace there. That they've really abandoned the faith.
Now, there's somebody in the chat, I don't know if this is the case, I haven't kept up with Michael, but there's somebody in the chat saying that Lofton has already said that if Francis does teach the female deaconesses, that he'll support that. Well, of course he will. So what does that tell you?
How are you as an Eastern Orthodox consistent when you already accepted the divine institution of the papacy in your ecumenical council?
Let's make it, this is a great point that I had a conversation with Ubi about, and Lofton makes a big argument about this, which is that you have to accept the papacy because it's divinely established. Now, he conflates divinely established with perpetuity and infallibility and indefectibility. There's all kinds of things divinely established that fell away. For example, God divinely established the judges. He raised up the judges in the periods of the Judges, the book of Judges. Did Israel continue to have judges like Deborah, Samson, Barak? No. God established a temple. The temple went away. God established bishops in the history of the church, and various churches fell away. In fact, Romans 11 says and warns the Roman church that they can fall away and they can be grafted out if they get prideful. Paul warns the church of Rome that they might be grafted out. If you look in Apocalypse 2 and 3, Jesus himself gives warnings to the various churches of Asia Minor that he will take away their lampstand. They might be grafted out in that sense. So there's all kinds of...
Which right away speaks to them losing grace. They've lost the light.
Yeah, and but this idea that just because a thing is, quote, divinely established, that therefore it has the indefectibility of the Petrine charism in the Roman Catholic sense is a non sequitur.
Precisely.
Because there's plenty of things priesthood. Divinely established who pass away. So
yeah, like the Levitical priesthood that passed away.
It was divinely established, right? But Michael hinges this. He uses this argument all the time. I mean, I don't even listen to him very much, but I've heard him make this argument multiple times that if something is, quote, divinely established, then it has perpetuity in the Petrine indefectible perpetual charism, which is just simply not it doesn't follow.
And again, it doesn't necessarily reflect their notions of papal supremacy either.
Yeah.
The Bishop of Rome never had the right to elect bishops in every see across the world, which he does now. No one becomes a bishop without a say-so. And they're not really, when you look at them, they don't function like bishops do in the Orthodox Church. They're essentially just proxies for the Pope. Yeah,
they're priests under the Pope. And the odd part is that when you have Pope St. Gregory's letter about the condemnation of universal bishop, if you read about that whole debacle, it was, if I recall, the Patriarch of Constantinople was going to say, I'm the universal bishop, and everyone else in the world, all the other bishops, are just priests to me. That's the context of that often quoted Pope St. Gregory the Great claim, that anyone who claims to be universal bishop is making himself Antichrist. The irony is that that is the very modus operandi that you just outlined, where in the Vatican I mindset, essentially that is the case. The rest of the bishops in the world are really just priests underneath the super bishop, the Pope, right?
Yeah, and I mean, even then, they can only ordain men to the diaconate, to the priesthood on what they call ember days. And I believe they even need the Pope's approval for that.
Yes, correct. And this is if I recall, like a early Middle Ages transition where, in the early canons, it takes two bishops and a metropolitan, or two or three bishops to ordain a bishop. Yeah. That's in the ancient canons. And then in the early Middle Ages, it should be obvious why. It switches, and the papacy says, now all bishops in the world are ordained by me. And that's a clear change of fundamental ecclesiology. Why would he do that? Well, because he wants all the bishops to be papists, clearly.
Yeah, and he wants them to be subject to him because he wants to be the church.
Exactly.
Including indefectibility of the Roman See. Yeah. So stories about La Salette and stories about the eclipse of the church. And the story about La Salette, the additional phrase that was later on added, and I've gone into this in more detail elsewhere, maybe just type in Michael Lofton La Salette, it should come up. That additional part where it talks about this, it talks about Rome will defect from the faith and become the seat of the Antichrist, which Vigano actually repeated a few years back. That, unfortunately, for radical traditionalists, is something that was added later and was not approved by Rome and is found on the Index of Forbidden Books. My knowledge, it was never removed from the Index of Forbidden Books.
Maybe there's a reason.
Oh, so wait a minute. Now we're supposed to care about the Index of Forbidden Books, which, by the way, Rome doesn't care about that anymore. But Lofton's still going to cite that. Which, by the way, why would we have an Index of Forbidden Books for decades, and then suddenly after Vatican II, it doesn't really matter? Like you can, there's no, you're not going to get in trouble, right, for some index of forbidden books. Doesn't that suggest a change in modus operandi?
Absolutely, and it also suggests that they have to quickly find a way to adapt to their changing ecclesiology to uphold their own relevance.
Oh, exactly. So the reason he's bringing this up is that I was talking about how Sedevacantists can't appeal to the prophecy of La Salette because none of that even matters because it was prior to Vatican I. So you might have had theories that the Roman See could apostatize and become Antichrist. Not after Vatican I. No more. If you're Roman Catholic.
Of course, with their ultramontanism, they would want you to think that.
Yeah, right. So I'm just explaining that it's a response to Sedevacantists.
Precisely.
So I don't know where Michael's taking it, but that was the point. That was the original thing Michael's commenting on.
Have canonical penalties for the Index of Forbidden Books today, but it's still, you have a moral responsibility to adhere to it. And so, moreover, you could note that, okay, Rome losing the faith doesn't necessarily mean that the See of Rome loses the faith. It could mean the people of the city of Rome.
So blame the people.
Yeah.
Don't blame your faulty hierarchs.
Yeah, it's not
You
the
know,
it's not the papacy. It's not Frank's fault. It may mean the people in Rome. It's their fault. Yeah, okay, that makes a lot of sense.
right. It's the lay people's fault for trusting their shepherds and falling into error because their shepherds have rights.
I've not spent a whole lot of time listening to Michael Lofton, so it's actually kind of comedic, like the level of Pope-splaining here. This is kind of funny.
Well, it's funny that he talks about moral obligation because, Pope Francis, didn't he say recently that it's a sin to proselytize and convert Orthodox?
Yeah, and then Michael says that proselytization is different from evangelization, and all the trads jumped on him and made fun of him because they actually played clips of him specifically saying, "Don't convert Orthodox people."
And
so
it's true, and
yeah.
then he gets. I remember because it was brought to my attention. I had actually someone from my parish asked me what to make of it. It was when one woman on YouTube had a really big video about how she converted to Orthodoxy, and immediately he went in on that. And I thought, okay, but don't you have a moral obligation to obey your pastor, your arch pastor?
Mm.
Yeah.
And so, but I just questioned the authenticity of that addition that's added to the prophecy of La Salette to begin with. And why are we appealing to these private revelations when we have sacred scripture itself that would overturn that, and we have ecumenical councils that would overturn that is way more authoritative than private
But
revelations?
they rely on private revelations all the time.
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, that might sound good, Michael, but everybody knows that Roman Catholicism is all about Fatima and private revelations.
Yeah, supposedly all of the Russian church and the people of Russia are going to become Catholic.
Well, let's not forget, everybody. Remember some months ago, all of the Catholic world, including the trads, were all in a tizzy because they were under the impression that due to Ukraine stuff, Pope Francis was going to consecrate Russia in the right way, right? Because the supposed consecration to the Immaculate Heart has never actually been done in the right magical formula. And then Francis is going to do it. And I told you, told you guys, this is a nothing burger. Nothing's going to come of this. And that's exactly what happened. But all these people were hyping it up.
Oh, of course.
This is the kind of stuff that a lot of Orthodox have bought into. They bought into those La Salette arguments and the radical traditionalist content. And
now, we didn't buy into this at all.
I forgot all about it until he brought it up.
Yeah, I mean, as an Orthodox Christian, we don't do this stuff typically. Are there miracles? Sure. Can Mary appear? Sure. But Orthodox people don't care about Marian apparitions, so I don't know what he's talking about that part.
No, and for us, we don't give any validity to Marian apparitions. This is why we reject Fatima, we reject the Immaculate Heart, we reject the Sacred Heart. I think David Erhan did a really good video on that one.
Yeah, and pointed out that these guys were wrong in saying that, no, we don't worship the physical heart. Oh, yes, you do. Pius the 12th encyclical says you do.
Precisely.
Look at this and they say, well, I'm buying into this and this doesn't make sense for me to remain Catholic, therefore I'm going to go Sedevacantists, I'm going to go Eastern Orthodox. Then they get to Orthodoxy, they see that their bishops are sitting there praying, with Vespers and other services and ecumenical gatherings with Catholics, and so they're like, okay.
Now, how often does this happen? I've never seen any bishop that I have communed under or with in my 5 years now of Orthodoxy participating in an ecumenical service or engaging in services with Roman Catholics. So I have no idea what he's talking about.
Me neither. Only the ones that are close to the globalist elites do that.
Yeah, I mean, okay, does he mean Bartholomew? Okay, maybe Bartholomew. Maybe, a couple other bishops that are prominent out there that are open ecumenists. But I don't really think that this is the normative experience. Now, he might also be referring to the fact that, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but it's my understanding that a Catholic person, a Roman Catholic person, even a priest or a bishop or something like this, could conceivably attend an Orthodox liturgy, right?
Conceivably, in a certain extent. So
I mean,
this is
not
where,
participate in the communion,
yeah,
but they could come to a church, right?
they can come to the church. Now there is canons on this. I actually wrote an article for Orthodox Ethos on this recently, and I
Okay.
plan to
Okay.
expand on it. But one of the things that the canons actually lay out is that they can attend, especially because they might be curious.
Mm-hmm.
This could be the beginning of conversion, but if they
Right.
have no intention of repenting or leaving their heresy, or if they're not coming for the purpose of looking to do that, then typically the canonical place that they should be staying is in the narthex. They can't even enter into the nave.
Interesting.
So they can come,
Mm-hmm.
but if they don't have any intention of repenting of their heresy, they can't come into the worship space and participate in the worship.
Interesting.
And of course, naturally, if we were to apply economia in this case and let them stand in the nave, at the moment that the royal doors are closing in the Russian practice, and we say, the doors, and we start saying catechumens depart, they got to leave.
That
they
makes
have
sense.
to.
Right. That makes sense. Yeah, that's a
because-
great point. That's a great point on that. Yeah.
But we don't go to their services because we still believe in upholding the apostolic canons.
Right, which forbid us from participating in their services.
Yeah, and the actions of Patriarch Bartholomew or other patriarchs, who again are on the World Council of Churches and other ecumenist ventures, they're not reflective of the whole of Orthodoxy. They may represent large regions, but they're not reflective of all of it because they do not have supreme authority over us.
Right.
I have even though Patriarch Kirill is my patriarch, my first hierarch is Metropolitan Nikolai.
Right.
And my bishop, my archbishop, I know for a fact he's very, very not ecumenist.
Yeah, exactly.
His position is that, hey, we baptize Catholics.
Exactly.
I just left this. I don't want to be in communion with these guys. So then they leave that for more radical versions of Orthodoxy, like Jay Dyer has done. And some
Yeah, and this is not true. So he's he's constructed this idea that
That you're in a different
wasn't.
version of.
Yeah, I could go to an Antiochian church and commune if I wanted to. There's no restrictions on me. I've been to Serbian churches. I've been to Antiochian churches in the last several years. There's no problems. I'm not under any ban or restriction, and it had nothing to do with that. It was because I moved to an area where the church that I found closest to me, where I found a spiritual father, was at the Russian church in Florida. So he's assumed that I didn't get along with some Antiochian person, which I had a disagreement with one priest, but that has nothing to do with anything else. And
No, that doesn't.
I didn't leave, but I didn't leave anything. This is what he's misunderstanding.
No, and that doesn't mean that you had and this is kind of a common misconception Catholics have, where they seem to, they'll say, "Oh, which Orthodox?"
Right.
And it's like, no, like the Eastern Orthodox Church as a whole is in communion. And the Russian Orthodox Church is really the one with the most unique expression in terms of liturgical music, investments, but otherwise the content's all the same. And the asceticism, the idea behind it is the same. Sure, most of the time you go to a Russian church, you're not going to find pews. Why? Because, we're supposed to technically stand in prayer. That being said, when you go to a place with pews, you're going to find that people are standing most of the time.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And we're not necessarily going to say, well, you have pews, you're heretics, or well, you're on the new calendar, you're a heretic. We don't do that. It's St. Paisios said it well when he said, yes, the Pope made the new calendar, but an idolater made the old. And so we have to be careful not to make idols of certain things, which the papacy often does, in which it makes an idol of itself. And so when he's doing this, he's attacking you for being part of a radical group of Orthodoxy. But if he means radical in the sense that we don't derivate from holy tradition, that we believe in maintaining what has always been taught, upheld, and believed by everyone, everywhere, at all times,
Right.
then call me a radical.
Yeah,
Because
exactly.
that's a compliment at that point.
Yeah, right, exactly.
like even that group is not Orthodox enough because they're not following the canons. And then they go into more extreme versions of Orthodoxy, breakaway groups in Orthodoxy.
I'm not involved in any breakaway group. Never been involved in any breakaway group. So this is a complete mischaracterization. So I don't know where he's getting this.
We understand there's a limit to that.
They're called the true Orthodox. And these are the ones that are not canonically in communion with world Orthodoxy. They're these breakaway groups. In fact, I did a whole video on that not long ago. I did.
As have we. So I'm not sure what he
what
thinks.
about the CMRI? What about the SSDX?
I was going to say, I mean, could we not point to countless breakaway Roman Catholic independent chapels? So I don't know what he thinks this is going to prove. I mean, if this is some sort of critique, this applies to everybody. Everybody's group has breakaway groups, right? So what is that?
Yeah.
What does that have to do with what's true or false? Not really anything.
Put it in the show note description on True Orthodox. I did a whole video reviewing all these breakaway groups in Orthodoxy and how this mentality that people like J. Dyer have bought into leads them into those really radical breakaway groups within Orthodoxy.
I mean, we've
actually
addressed this many times for many years. David has multiple videos addressing this. I mean, it's just simply not true. So
in my time as an Orthodox Christian and being a priest, I get people reaching out to me all the time with various things, especially
Right.
being one more in the public sphere. And I have yet to, I'm sure it'll happen one day, to be fair. I'm sure it'll happen one day, but I have never had someone say, Father, I've had it. I think, I'm just going to go and become a true Orthodox, or I'm going to go join the GOC, or I'm going to go join the schismatic branch that calls themselves ROCOR, or whatever acronym they add after that. They understand that the synaxis of bishops, the union of the church is important, but they also understand that, of course, upholding the doctrine and the faith is important. And so, we're not so, I think he's kind of got this caricaturized image of us in his head where he thinks we're these angry, people who have to just make sure that everything is extremely to the letter. We do understand that the church is not Monophysite in nature, unlike what the Roman Catholics believe.
yeah, well, the irony is that he also says that they'll also make this criticism that economia is liberal and y'all don't have a consistent doctrine. You guys are liberal with economia. So are we like hyper rigorous, or are we hyper liberal?
Yeah,
Which one is it?
Which one is it?
Because again, they've already bought into this concept of I'm sitting here privately judging my patriarch. They already bought into that when they were Catholic, because they did that to the Pope. So whenever
Well, this is ironic because, Michael had just admitted that there might be this theoretical situation where the Pope could privately teach heresy, but he's protected from not doing so. But even that is still a judgment. You're still making a judgment on your Pope, on your hierarch, to say that, well, I'm still going to follow him, but he's Orthodox. That's a judgment, right? So he's always doing this thing where he conflates the idea of an individual assessing whether a hierarch or another person is Orthodox with, that's private judgment. But he's doing the same thing. He's saying, no, the Pope is Orthodox. The trads are wrong because they're judging the Pope as not being Orthodox. That's still doing the same private judgment that he's saying is in principle wrong. But this is unavoidable. Everybody's going to have to make judgments about who they're going to be in communion with, where they're going to go to church, right? It's necessary by the fact of what's involved. If you're going to choose a church, you're going to have to make a judgment, right?
Yeah,
So
you have to make a decision to go where it's going to be ultimately best for you. A lot of the things that I tell people online is you have to look where things are being done properly. You don't want to have regrets later on. And this whole thing about
this idea, I don't mean to cut you off, that
no, that's fine.
that in Rome we're not making judgments and doing private judgment, but you are.
They are. It's a contradiction.
Right.
they come to Eastern Orthodoxy, they're privately judging their own patriarch and their own bishop, and then they feel like, well, my bishop is violating this canon, and my canon, there's canon saying that you can't pray with Catholics, and I'm seeing my bishop praying with Catholics, therefore I have to be out, I have to go to someone else who's following the canons, and then they shift communions and go to somewhere else, and again, they're not good enough for them, and so they go somewhere else, and before you know it, they're in this group that it's literally them and just a few other people.
But the irony is that Michael had this same journey. Michael, even though, obviously he thinks Orthodoxy is wrong, he spent time in the Greek Orthodox Church, and he felt that they weren't following the ancient canons about the papacy. And so he judged those people to be incorrect. And now he's judged that Francis is correct. And now he's judged that the traditional Catholic bishops are all wrong, right? So there's still the judging is there, right? The private judgment is unavoidable.
It is unavoidable. It's going to be in everything that you do.
where, unfortunately, the radical traditionalism that figures like J. Dyer have bought into, that's where it takes you.
How many times has he said this about 50 times, and we're only about 30 minutes in. I don't think we'll have time to do this whole thing, but it's 50 times he said radical traditional.
Some people take it.
There's nothing radical about it.
Well, it's just that it's an attempt to sort of portray it as a certain extremist.
It's to try to make it
extreme,
to try and highlight it
and break away into a group where there's literally two people in a fake monastery somewhere who are claiming to be the ones who are preserving the faith. And then others kind of go the Orthodox route and end up going into breakaway groups that are also pretty small.
This is a good point that somebody in the chat makes, is that why did Lofton privately judge it good for him to switch to the Eastern Rite? Did he judge that his local Novus Ordo was not faithful to the canons?
Yeah, perhaps he found it too irreverent, which would be a private judgment.
Exactly.
Vatican I. Vatican I settled any of that would be in dispute for a Roman Catholic. Meaning,
I don't know why this music is playing as I talk.
What do you mean by received? Well, when the Roman College elects a pope, and when it's been accepted by the college and then by the Roman Catholic world, that's the Pope. Canon law is very clear.
And that is true. And that's one of the arguments I use against the Sedevacantist and also Benevacantists.
Clear that you have to accept who the Roman college accepts. And if you're going to say with the Sedevacantists that, the Roman college has apostatized. So then it's lost its constituent elements.
I wouldn't say the Roman college, like if he's talking about the College of Cardinals as a constituent element to the church, because there were obviously many instances in church history we didn't have a College of Cardinals. There were other ways.
No, I'm talking about if the way that we elect the Pope is gone. If a Sedevacantist made the argument that we can't listen to the Roman college anymore because they're all apostate, my point was that in the Roman Catholic system, you can't have a pope again. That was all I was trying to say.
Which a pope was elected, but canonically today, you have to have the College of Cardinals. So until a pope changes that, canonically,
that's essentially what I was saying.
It would make no sense that God would put us in a situation where we can't canonically elevate anyone else to the Roman see. So I would tweak what he's saying here, just make it a little bit more nuanced, and then I would actually be in agreement with it. And I use that argument again against the Sedevacantists and also the Benevacantists.
That is had, according to Vatican I, it's no longer a public, unifying, visible see in Rome, the city over in Rome, the city that is Rome, in Italy, the city-state, by the way. I mean, Vatican I is very clear, canon law is very clear that, you have to accept that dude. You can't pick them. You can't be a Protestant with your popes. Now, Michael Matt and all of the SSPX and all of the trads, they know that. And they have to have this preposterous position.
And here I'm in agreement with Jay. It is a preposterous position. And I've been calling out the radical traditionalists for their inconsistency.
I don't want to keep you too long if this is kind of going to get a little boring and sort of droning on.
Why are you Catholic?
No, I'm just listening. I'm thinking he's going kind of around the same thing nonstop.
And he also he interrupted. He paused it a lot, so
you're right for the.
We've only gotten we got a little ways into it, so let's see where he goes.
Because you've already bought into the Roman indefectibility in the first millennium. You don't recognize it, but your church has already bought into that in the ecumenical councils. So
he really hinges everything on this letter of Saint Agatha. And again, I think if you read Denny's book, the chapter on that is really good. I think really just sort of puts it deflates the wind out of the sails that Michael has in this regard. It's over there on the shelf, but I would have thought he would be pulling from other things, but he seems to they've shifted. They used to make this hinge everything on Pope St. Leo's tome, and then Ibarra has backed off from all of that, where he now admits that it wasn't originally ex cathedra. Over time it elevated to that status, and then Pope St. Leo said, now that's ex cathedra. So Ibarra has altered his position on that, and that's to deal with the fact that Ubi and other people really challenged him on this. And rather than just say he got it wrong, which is he can't do, he can never admit that he got something wrong. He sort of had to modify this, and they don't really use this Pope St. Leo ex cathedra argument anymore. It seems like they're really now shifted over to Agatho's letter, but as we said, the investigation that took place for, I think, 2 weeks of Agatho's letter, Denny mentions it was the same model, the way that they investigated Leo's tome to see if it matched up to the teaching of Cyril. And that is not the Pope judging the council. That is the council judging the Pope's letter. And this really,
they're judging it as being theologically correct.
Exactly. And that's, again, no one judges the first see. Vatican I is very clear that it doesn't operate that way in the Vatican I mindset.
Just as inconsistent, you just don't see it.
Mental gymnastics to make the system work, by which an apostate who doesn't follow the gospel, who wars against the truth, wars against Christ, wars against tradition and against the church, is also the supreme infallible teacher of all.
You see, Jay Dyer's also bought into that. And that's one of the reasons why he left Catholicism.
Correct. Yeah, because the Pope wars against the truth.
This idea that
Correct.
Vatican II
That's why I'm not a
revolutionized
unit.
the church.
So it didn't revolutionize the church, according to Michael Lofton right there. So let's read what Vatican II says about, real quick, I'll just do this briefly. What does Vatican II say about Hindus and Muslims?
Oh, yes. Please bring this up.
Right, because, again, you just heard him say that, Dyer's bought into this lie that Vatican II revolutionized the church. There was some revolutionary theology. And this is funny because all of the trads, they all know this, right? They know what Nostra Aetate says. I got all my Vatican II notes here. I'm trying to find Nostra Aetate. I can't find it in this.
And Father Peter Heers wrote a book on the assessment, the appraisal of the ecclesiastical renovations of Vatican II. And one of the arguments that he really well lays out in that book there is how, the Roman Catholics now have redefined what baptism is, where the boundaries of the church are. And so how is that not a war against the truth? How is that not becoming an enemy of the truth when Christ makes it very clear that he is the way, the truth, and the life, that none come to the Father except through him?
Right. That
the authority to bind and loose is given to his apostles and to their successors.
So I bet you guys can see this. I'm going to read you a couple sections of Vatican II. The first one is from the Decree on Religious Liberty, and it says that it is now necessary for modern states to engage in religious liberty and religious freedom. The Vatican Council declares that the human person has a right to religious freedom. Freedom is thus of this kind means freedom for everyone, that it should be immune from coercion of individuals, social groups, and every human power. Basically saying that it's essentially inviolable. The Council further declares the right to religious liberty is based on the dignity of the human person and free from all forms of coercion. Now, whatever you think about religious liberty, the point is that this had been explicitly condemned multiple times over in multiple papal encyclicals, which if you get this book from Tan, The Popes Against the Modern Errors, it will list them. I have them listed already. Morari Vos, Mortalium Animos number 2, Denzinger 139. You can look at the Syllabus of Errors number 77, 78, and number 55. You can also look at Syllabus of Errors 55, 77, and 78. And those all condemn in no ambiguous terms the notion of religious liberty. So here's a clear contradiction on magisterial, papal, ordinary teaching in multiple encyclicals, multiple condemned propositions. Again, Morari Vos, Mortalium Animos number 2, Denzinger 139, and Syllabus of Errors 55, 77, and 78. And now it is dogmatic because the decrees of Vatican II are normative. They are dogmatic, even though they're not. It's said to be a pastoral council. It has already been stated 4 times in Catholic papal teaching that you have to accept Vatican II. So this is a myth where the trads say, "Oh, I don't have to accept Vatican II." No, the popes have said 4 times you do. And I'm bringing that one up because everybody knows about the ecumenist stuff. I just want to remind people that it's not just the ecumenist stuff in Nostra Aetate. It's the contradiction on the notion of Catholic states, the enforcement of the Catholic religion in Catholic states, and then the de-Catholicizing of the state under the Vatican II principles of religious liberty, which are now said to be not Catholic theology. So just a flat-out 100% contradiction in regard to church and state. And then the religious liberty, Nostra Aetate says, let's go to that next. I'll just read the quote about Muslims and Hindus. This is Nostra Aetate 2. Throughout history to the present day, there is a difference among people at a certain awareness of that have a certain awareness of a hidden power. It lies behind nature and the events of human life. At times, there is even even present a recognition of a supreme being, or sometimes even a father. This awareness and recognition results in a way of life that is imbued with deep religious sense. The religions which are found throughout advanced civilizations endeavor by ways of well-defined concepts and exact language to answer these questions. Thus, in Hinduism, now remember, Leo XIII had said Hinduism is a demonic religion of darkness. What does Vatican II say about Hinduism? It says, in Hinduism, people explore the divine mystery, and they express it in the limitless riches of myth and the accurately defined insights of philosophy. They seek release from the trials of the present life by ascetic practices, profound meditation, and recourse to capital G God in confidence and love. So the religion of Hinduism, which Father Seraphim Rose says is demonry, demonic.
Yep, it's demonic.
Vatican II is explicitly stating that it is a means by which Hindus, through their meditation yoga, may achieve direct knowledge or some sort of knowledge of God. I guess it wouldn't be direct knowledge of God, but they have recourse to God in love.
But according to them, they're not even experiencing God's uncreated energies or anything like that, because God apparently is his energies, according to the Catholic mindset. Exactly. And so, there's no consistency here. And this again kind of backs up what you said earlier, that yes, the Pope is the enemy. He is he is warring against the church. He's warring against the truth.
Well, imagine just look at the practices of the Vatican, which I'd be interested to hear what Michael's reply would be when somebody says, you're telling me that there's not a defection from the faith, when both Benedict, who's supposed to be the traditionalist, and Francis have gone into mosques and prayed towards Mecca.
Same with Pope John Paul II. He kissed the Quran.
Assisi,
and Assisi, and they omitted any mentioning of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit from their prayers. So who were they praying to? Right. That's the question Father Seraphim Rose poses in Orthodoxy and the Religion of the Future.
Exactly.
Is at war with tradition. He bought into all that the popes in the post-conciliar era are at war with tradition.
So he's saying that I'm wrong for buying into this story that the papacy is warring against tradition. But this is what the papacy teaches now. This is what the papacy is promoting. And you see it in his actions, is my point. I don't have to go to all the documents, because remember, in Catholic theology, the public expression is the reflection of the interior disposition. And so if the papacy is receiving pagan blessings, pagan prayers, if they're participating in pagan services, which is well documented, then that tells me the interior disposition. I don't have to sit around and find and mine through all the documents to see if this is the case. Just participate. I mean, just think about the fact that the canons said in the ancient church that you can't go to these services.
No, you can't.
And that's talking about heterodox. That's talking about heterodox services.
Yeah,
this is talking about other religions.
Yeah, according to the apostolic canons, you can't even go into a synagogue and light their lamps. You can't bring them an offering of oil, and you can't receive religious tokens or holiday offerings from Jews, heretics, or heathens. You can't accept these things from them. And what is the Pope doing when he's accepting gifts from the Amazonians who came to his Amazon Synod? What is he doing when he is participating in this prayer service before these really ugly little idols?
Right.
What is he doing? And that's the thing. I mean, when we even look at again, the ecclesiology, in my opinion, says it all of Vatican II, and they go as far as to claim that Protestants and Orthodox are in communion with Rome via
Right.
their baptisms, but an imperfect communion. So you can have half of Christ.
Yeah,
And
you can have 30%, and then that's why Fratelli Tutti, the Frank's encyclical, it actually has prayers for non-Trinitarians.
uh,
Yeah, no, I'm serious. So it gives prayers that you can do with Frank, I guess, that are not Trinitarian. So you have the Trinitarian option, but you also have, if we want to include
and
Unitarians.
how is that not teaching heresy? How is that not using his office to teach something as heretical as having a non-Trinitarian prayer? Who are you praying to at this point?
Well, the irony is that Mortalium Animos of Pius XI actually identifies these things as defections from the faith. So thankfully, we actually have a papal statement already telling us that these interfaith gatherings are a defection from the faith. But these people never talk about Mortalium Animos. They just blow past and ignore it when it actually says that anybody who participates, this is the papacy, Pius XI, 1928, saying that no Catholic can participate in these kinds of interfaith gatherings because it is a defection from the faith to do so. In other words, the public action of participating is saying, I have defected from this faith and I am now part of some other world religion.
Precisely.
And so he says, look, this doesn't make sense. And he goes elsewhere.
All Christians and the Vicar of Christ. This is why this position leads people to alcoholism, atheism, and mental instability.
What?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
No,
I've known
no,
I've
actually-
known a lot of trads over the years, many of them, and
Well,
that is a pattern.
And this is something the Holy Fathers teach. This is something that a lot of monastics teach. Again, there's a good book that I read recently, another Uncut Mountain Press title, and it was on noetic prayer, and it actually talks about how falling into heresy is a disorder of the soul.
Yeah.
And when we look at what Orthodox anthropology is and what Metropolitan Eurothios teaches in his book on spiritual illness and on St. Gregory Palamas and Egia, right? He points out that the nous becomes disordered when we start believing in incorrect things, when we start holding heresies, because it distorts your worldview.
Yep.
And as that happens, your intellect or your nous becomes scattered. And as a result of not having that proper connection with God and things to bring things back into order, you can fall into these other illnesses like alcoholism to cope with it, and insanity. It's something that we see with a lot of Protestants, is that there's a lot of the time, the after effects of them dealing with group hysteria when they come home from their services, and they're fatigued, or they start having depression. I mean, I remember when I was a Protestant, I was 14, all my friends said they could speak in tongues. I was like, well, I can't.
Yeah.
And they're like, well, God mustn't like you very much.
Right. Yeah. You're not doing it right. Yeah.
Exactly. You got to get the right to, should have bought a Honda is happening, right? But
Yeah, and so he's laughing at what I said, but what I was talking about was the experience in the traditional Catholic world of all flavors, whether you're just a Novus Ordo who's traditionally minded, or you go to the FSSP, the Diocesan Latin Masses, or whether you're SSPX, or whether you're Sedevacantists. That whole world is always dismal. They're always unhappy because of the difficulty in doing the mental gymnastics of trying to explain what's in everybody's face, right? Francis's public defection, public scandals, public apostasy, public heresy, all the time, constantly. You have to constantly cope and do the mental gymnastics. And what that does is it makes you divided against yourself, because you're having to explain and contradict what is in your face. And my point there was not that the problem is mainly intellectual. And this is what I had.
It's actually
it's spiritual.
It's spiritual.
Right.
It's a problem with the nous.
Exactly. And I never got that
yeah.
until Orthodoxy diagnosed me. That's the point. Is that you get the diagnosis.
Yeah, that's what happens. That's the whole point of nepsis, is to be able to get that diagnosis and then to eventually identify the problems yourself as they enter, and then through the power of prayer and through the reception of grace through the sacraments, you gradually go into remission with this. You gradually remit your sins, and gradually your nous becomes more ordered and gains control over the faculty of the heart, and it gains control over the thoughts of, you gain control over your own thoughts. You don't have these racing thoughts. You don't you know, a lot of the things that I experienced in particular with young men reaching out to me who are struggling with leaving Catholicism is they have a bit of a paranoid state.
Yeah.
A lot of them are paranoid. They're neurotic.
I went through that. Yeah.
Yeah, and I went through a period of that too. I mean, I was very neurotic. I was very paranoid. I was afraid when my wife couldn't even go to mass because I thought she was going to hell because the
Right.
church thought it was a mortal sin. And then there's all these contradictions in there, and it scatters your intellect.
Yeah.
And meanwhile, your whole experience of God is something that is imaginary. They encourage the use of imaginative prayer.
Right.
So now you're worshiping potentially a counterfeit, or you're falling into prayer list, and you think that you're having divine revelation. You know, if you're Mary Margaret Alacoque, or however you say her name, you know, or if you're experiencing the Fatima thing, you know,
Or if you're Taylor Marshall and Mary appears to you in a dream regarding her breasts and all this nonsense, right?
Yeah,
And I'm not trying to be crude, but I'm saying that this is an
I
example.
remember hearing that.
It's an example of what you're talking about.
Yeah, and that's prayer list. It's like the first thing you should do when you have these things, even as an Orthodox person, is question it,
Right.
ignore it, take it to your spiritual father and say, Father, this is what happened. I don't trust myself. Help me to understand where there could be some deception here. And a good spiritual father is not going to say something like, oh, you've had a revelation. Oh, you're a saint. You have gifts. They're going to say, you know what? You should ignore this. Let's get your prayer life on top of things.
Exactly.
Let's make sure maybe you're coming to confession more regularly. You got to do whatever it is you got to do to bring the person's life back into order, back into balance. And that's, I right away picked up on that when you were talking about that. It's like, no, he's speaking to the nous. He's not talking about scholastic intellect.
Yeah,
It actually is the lower region of the person's
exactly. Yeah, it's
faculties.
not the intellect is not the highest faculty, and I'm saying this because in the Roman Catholic system it is.
Yeah,
and this is so important because I think when Roman Catholics hear this, they think, oh, ha, 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 he's talking about this goofy mystical nous doctrine. It's not that. It's a human faculty that has to be healed, because that's the real issue here, the heart. It's not primarily an intellectual problem. There is an intellectual element to this theology and the books and all this, but it's not, what I'm saying is that man's problem, my problem that I had as a trad, was not primarily intellectual. It was primarily a problem of noetic repentance, right?
Precisely.
Repenting so that the noetic faculty could operate in the proper way. And that only happens in the church, which is the hospital of the soul.
And that's the thing with a lot of Catholics, and I'm not saying this to demonize anyone, because there's a lot of virtuous people who are Catholics, you know, who really do try hard to live a virtuous life. But again, you encounter more often than not, I found in my experience, these people who are paranoid, who are neurotic. And the problem is that for them, it's turned upside down, where, like you said, for them, it's the logic and reasoning that's the highest part.
Right.
And as a result, it suppresses and weighs down that part that is receptive.
Yes.
And I had someone say, you know, how can I tell that things are going well in that direction, that I'm becoming healthy? And it's like, when you start actually feeling sorrow for your sins, not because you've been caught, not because your pride has been wounded, but because you know that it is a direct disobedience to God, that it's a disregard for God, and that truly you don't love God. You know, and anyone who says they love God, they're suffering from pride, because if you did, you would assess this more carefully. You would assess it more carefully. You wouldn't get up on a podium and say, you know what, I love God, and that's why I do this and this. That's your pride talking. You know, you have to really stop and assess, am what I'm experiencing, is what I'm feeling, am I praying in a way that is reflective of what we see in the lives of saints and the church fathers? And the Catholics overlook this, and they go on and on about these visions or these intellectual musings of people like Thomas Aquinas, who ultimately did not have the experience that St. Gregory Palamas had.
Right.
And as a result, they couldn't clearly define or understand the person of God. They couldn't understand the distinction between the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. And so they can't even now have this concept of uncreated energies, that God is able via his uncreated energies to directly participate in our lives. And that existence is not his essence, you know, and that the energies are not his essence.
Absolutely. I want to go to the super chats. We got through the next 20 minutes or so of Lofton's presentation, so we'll move on to the super chats because we've gone for 2 hours. I don't want to keep Fr Mikhail for too long. But guys, I did put his if you do want to support him, he has a Patreon, which I will put that link. So if you want to support his church, you can do so by doing that there with Patreon. And I think the essence of what we come to tonight is just this main point, which is that instead of Pachamama, basically what we're saying is that we need to follow La Leche Mama, right? The mother's milk. I'm just joking. That was a dumb joke. I couldn't resist because I was sitting here thinking of La Leche, and I was thinking Pachamama, Leche Mama. Anyway, it was a dumb joke.
You need to have a little bit of levity.
Yeah. Okay, so Paco says for $5, I'm glad that this crossover finally occurred, and happy for both of you. God bless. Please do this again in the future. Yeah, Father Mikhail is always welcome if he wants to come back, and appreciate him coming on.
Definitely, I had a good time.
I will also, of course, as you guys know, I will split the super chats with him, so it's not all going to me and my my Gucci estate in the countryside. Veil of Reality, $3. What is the best line of argumentation against the idea that Jesus was a hoax, as some of the pagans say? Do you have any reading suggestions on this idiocy? I mean, yeah, there's plenty of books out there that a lot of Protestants even put out books rebutting the notion that Jesus didn't exist. I mean, there's ample historical evidence. Off the top of my head, I don't even know what if you go to I think Lewis has talked about at Orthodox Shahada. Oh, and by the way, I meant to mention to everybody that Orthodox Shahada is banned in Pakistan. So they got banned tonight in an entire country. Kai posted the thing on YouTube. It says, "Hi, Orthodox Shahada. We would like to inform you that we've received a legal complaint against your account. You will be banned in the nation of Pakistan." So that's a badge of honor. It's a badge of honor. So that
something right.
they're doing, they're doing. But anyway, I would just look up, texts proving the historicity of Jesus. But evidential apologetics is not my strong suit. We do have to do evidential apologetics at times because evidences are part of apologetics. But off the top of my head, I don't know of a book that argues purely for the historicity of Christ. There are plenty out there. You could get a book like Craig Blomberg's book defending the historicity of the four Gospels, for example. That's one. Palantir, $1. What's the Orthodox understanding of the priesthood of all believers? During the Reformation, this passage was cited by all of the Protestants. I think that, I'll let Father Mikhail speak too. I don't mean to cut him off or.
No, that's all right.
But I think that, the Protestants just sort of smush this into only referring to everyone. And so, on the one hand, it's ironic because it continues the idea of priesthood, which Protestants typically don't like the idea of priesthood, but yet they admit that there is a priesthood of all believers. And yet they're denying the ministerial priesthood, which is just as well attested to in the New Testament in, for example, the letters of Paul and Jesus' promises to the apostles. So,
and that's the thing. We see that there's a distinction between the priesthood of all believers and eldership.
Right.
And we even see these titles used in the New Testament, like technically I'm a presbyter, right? But at one point, the rank between presbyter and episcopos was used interchangeably because the presbyter was the local overseer of his specific community, which as a priest that is still my job. I'm the second priest at my parish, but my job is to help oversee and meet the spiritual needs of the community. And the problem is that the way the Protestants view the priesthood of all believers is that they're not realizing that this priesthood speaks to offering themselves and to one another, and their whole life on the altar of worship to God, that the whole of our life is actually supposed to be the divine liturgy. That when we go to the liturgy, we're seeing the sum of it. We're seeing the schema or the schematic, if you will, of our lives. And we're supposed to go into the world and offer that. We're supposed to deify by living a Christian life. So this is why we bless our food. This is why we say our prayers when we wake up, when we go to bed. Bishop Luke of Syracuse said it best when he said that, Orthodoxy is something that you do from the moment you get up to the moment you go down for the night. It is a 24/7 commitment. And so that is the priesthood of all believers. You're offering your life. You're offering, the whole of your experience to God. You offer you offer it back, and He sanctifies. And so what our job is to do as presbyters is to be deified and to deify. And so we offer that on a larger level.
Yeah, and remember that in a lot of the Protestant world, everything is cashed out as either ors. So, for example, Protestants will say, well, you either have priests or you have the priesthood of all believers. Well, in the Orthodox view, there's both. There is the priesthood of all believers and the ministerial priesthood. It's a both and, not an either or.
Yeah, we don't add and we don't take away.
Promethean, $5. Thank you for this explanation of wisdom. Well, thank you. Appreciate that, Promethean. Storm the Cat, $10. Hello, I like your videos. Thank you, Storm the Cat. I like your comment, and we appreciate your super chat. P Divine, $3. What would be the best argument against someone who says Christianity is a psyop via the resurrection and messianic prophecies? A psyop of Satan. Why would Satan use Christianity as a psyop? I don't know. That's an odd.
Yeah,
so
it's a little self-contradictory.
Maybe they're meaning in a Gnostic sense, like I don't understand that question. I'm sorry, I just don't get it. I'm trying to give it make like maybe they mean like, what if a Gnostic said that the Christian church is a psyop of the evil demiurge, and then what? So we would have to meditate and become, get secret knowledge to get, access to the real reality and escape this reality. I mean, all those Gnostic systems, I've done 2 lengthy critiques of the various Gnostic sects and systems. There's not really a Gnosticism, right? There's like multiple sects in the ancient world, and they're all conflicting, and they're all kind of, it's all a bunch of foolishness and sort of relativism, basically. I mean, Gnosticism is absurd. So... but I assume that's what they mean. All right. Well, I don't see any more super chats, but thank you guys so much for the support tonight. And I'll split these. And you can also, again, support Fr Mikhail on his Patreon, which we have linked there as well. And I'm sure he'll come back, hopefully, in the future for more excellent conversations. And if you would, guys, like and share, put this information out there. We want to bring people into the Orthodox Church. So thank you again, Fr Mikhail. And
thank you for having me, Jay. This was an honor and a pleasure.
Yeah. Anything else you want to leave us with?
Just may God bless you all, and have a wonderful evening. And just keep it, for those of you who are inquiring into the faith, keep digging deeper. Keep
Awesome.
digging deeper, and tune into whatever is going to help you out with learning the faith. This is a great resource here. So make use of it and approach everything with prayer.